Eastern Med or the Aegean or anything like that. But I just want to make one small point, which I think can apply to bigger countries in Southern Europe. I was there in early 2017, and we asked the authorities how they had coped with trying to identify trafficked people amongst mixed migration flows, especially in 2015-16 when the numbers were pretty high. And North Macedonia has roughly 2 million inhabitants, so everything is relatively small. I live in Wales, we have 3 million, and it's relatively small. And they said, look, these people were coming through at some point in thousands per day. We had some people trained in identifying trafficked people or looking for indicators of trafficking, but it was simply not possible. We were overwhelmed. And I had some sympathy for what they were saying, because they were not dismissive of the problem. They did not deny the problem. They said we just could not handle it. And there's a balance there, of course. We can say to them, but you have an obligation under Article 10 of our convention to identify trafficked people, to have people trained to do it. But sometimes, it doesn't work. Germany somehow managed to take on more than 1 million people in 2015-16. But Germany is the biggest, wealthiest country in Europe. The UK prides itself on having taken about 20,000. Our record is pathetic. So one has to, from the European perspective, and I say this as somebody who's personally monitored about 10 European countries, one has to be aware of the legal duties that European countries have to identify trafficked people in mixed migration flows and to provide protection for them. And then also to understand that even if countries are not in bad faith, sometimes they cannot do it. And one of the problems that we have with some countries, although this does not really apply to Spain or Italy, is that even if they have the best will to do a good job, they do not always have the resources, and sometimes they're dependent upon funding from Brussels or from Washington to get things done, external funding. And my view is that I'd rather you get the money from somewhere and do the job than do nothing. But ideally, these countries should have the infrastructure there already to do this job and not be dependent upon the goodwill of the EU or the US or whoever it might be tomorrow. So there's certainly an issue there. Now, I should tell you that and when I say that the states have a duty to identify trafficked people and vulnerable people, it's not just under our convention, it's also under Article 4 of the European Convention on Human Rights. And this was stated very clearly in a case involving Austria in 2017. So, and of course, Article 4 is the prohibition on slavery, forced labor, and servitude. So we're talking about a clear legal obligation here. And this is why the attitude of some countries that refuse even to think that trafficked people could be refugees or have some entitlement, say, to complementary protection, that for me is really quite worrying. Now, we also visited Italy in 2017 for the first time under what we call a special procedure, because we were concerned, by we I mean Greta, about what was happening to people, to possible trafficking victims in mixed migration flows. And we published a report which set out a number of measures that Italy should try to take to address this situation. And I have to say, I was not on that visit, but I was involved in drafting the report. My overall impression of Italy was that things seemed to be a little bit chaotic, not just with regard to identifying trafficked people in mixed migration flows, but actually on the ground, the practice was sometimes extremely good. But that did not always come through in the overall picture of the country. So I think that Italy does have some things to do, but it is not the case, in my opinion, that Italy is only doing bad things in failing to identify trafficked people. That would be quite unfair, in my opinion. So that's what I would say about Italy. We visited Spain in 2017, and in Spain, we also asked, in our report, we asked Spain to, and I'm quoting, to pay increased attention to the proactive detection of victims of trafficking amongst asylum seekers and so on. And we also referred to the autonomous cities and the Spanish cities on the North African coast and asked them to address that in particular. Last year, and I was closely involved in the drafting of this, we published what's called a guidance note on the entitlement of victims of trafficking and persons at risk of being trafficked to international protection. And this is something that countries such as Malta and Spain and Italy, we would like them to pay particular attention to this, because in our view, it is very clear that there is, first of all, a duty to identify trafficked people, but secondly, an obligation to give at least some of them international protection, be it refugee status or subsidiary protection or some other form of complementary protection. So I'm quite unhappy. I know that Malta is not the biggest player in this, but it is a player nevertheless. But I'm quite unhappy with countries which simply do not recognize the legal possibility that trafficked people could have an entitlement to refugee status or international protection. So that's to some extent where we are on that. I want to take just a couple more minutes, if you don't mind. We believe very strongly that training is vitally important. Training is a major deficiency. The disparity of practice and training programs in European countries in all aspects of human trafficking, but including in identifying trafficked people, is immense. There's little systematic ongoing training programs. You know, people retire, people move on, people take new jobs. And there's no point in saying in 2020 we trained 200 border guards when half of them have gone on to other jobs the next year. So the training is seriously inadequate in most countries. And again, that is not always because of bad faith, but there needs to be better understanding of the need to enable people, people working on the borders, people working in other government agencies, people working in hospitals, to be able to identify those who have been trafficked or who are at risk. And we're not the first organization to have drawn attention to this. The UNHCR itself in 2006 published guidelines on the possible entitlement of trafficked people to refugee status, and I was involved in drafting these guidelines. Now, so what I would say to conclude, as things stand, not enough is being done in Europe to ensure effective identification of trafficked people and people who are at risk of being trafficked in mixed movements. For me, it's particularly concerning that some countries do not even countenance the possibility that trafficked people might need and be entitled to international protection. And this is a legal duty that needs to be respected and adhered to. And this requires two things. This is my final point. It requires two things. First of all, it needs money, i.e. more resources to enable identification. Nothing happens without money. But it needs attitude as well. It's not just a matter of minds. The hearts need to be won over, and that means the recognition that with effective identification go international protection obligations. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the other presentations and to taking part in the discussion, and thank you for inviting me to take part this morning.
Thank you very much, Professor. And let me apologize for putting you on the spot all of a sudden. Of course, that well, it was not a test. With this thought that the subject of your presentation would be a very good starting point that others could build on. Just checking, and you clearly mentioned it is not just money. You know, how can we motivate states to increase their efforts here? I mean, you mentioned training. Money is at least a bit of an issue. You know, would a European budget help to counter trafficking, or is the main problem in the end that states seem to be shying away from their responsibilities here, and maybe shy away from either the sort of police and prosecuting work that it entails, and or the protection requirements that follow from it? Can you maybe say a few words more about that?
I would very much like to say a few words on that. I think that Spain and Italy, and I'll include Greece as well, although I know we're not looking at Greece this morning. I think they've had, to some extent, a bad press because they're bearing the full burden, if one calls it a burden, of people arriving across the Mediterranean from North Africa. And the Refugees Convention talks about burden sharing. The EU, the UK is no longer in the EU, but as a Polish citizen, I'm pleased to speak as a member of the EU. The EU talks about burden sharing. But most of them, apart from the Germans maybe, they just talk about it. The UK in particular has a very, very poor record. They talk about, oh, we have been accepting people for 100 years, especially Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe and so on. My father was an immigrant from Eastern Europe. I don't care. There's a big burden on the Italians and the Spanish and the Greeks, although we're not talking about Greeks this morning. And we need to do much more to help them. And that comes to money, for sure. And I know that Greece, for example, has been given a lot of help from Brussels. I suspect Italy and Spain have to some extent as well. But it is simply not fair to expect these countries, simply because they happen to be the closest to the migrant flows coming from North Africa. It is simply not fair to say that, to make the right noises and essentially, in my view, leave them in the lurch, apart from the Germans.
Joost, you are muted.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you very much for your introduction and for your passion. Now we move on to the next duo of speakers. That's Sarah Elliott, who's a legal officer with UNHCR, and Megan Denise Smith, a protection and GBV specialist for IOM, who will be presenting together on embracing complexity, calling for critical approaches in counter-trafficking policy and practice. Over to you, ladies.
Thank you very much, Special Envoy Klarenbeek. And I just want to check if everyone can hear me okay and see the slides on the screen. Yep. So I'm Sarah Elliott, and my co-presenter, Megan Denise Smith, she's calling in too from Bangladesh, Cox's Bazar. And we'd certainly like to thank the Mixed Migration Centre and UNHCR for giving us the opportunity to contribute to this really important discussion. As mentioned by Bram and by Vincent, people moving along migratory routes in the central Mediterranean region regularly experience exploitation and abuse. And the fact that this has become a norm, despite all the work that's being done, is entirely unacceptable. And we do need to change the way we think about it. As Vincent said, we need to reframe the debate. And ample studies that are based on growing data sets can now tell us exactly the location of harm, the types of perpetrators, and we know more and more about the economies of violence that are sustained in this region, as well as what pushes people towards that violence. And certainly one of the key industries designated to tackle one of the worst forms of violence on that route is the industry of counter-trafficking. And Megan and I noticed that in the recommendations coming out from the multiple and prolific studies that have been written about this, and as Bram mentioned, there will be many more to come, were often a set of undeveloped bullet points that stood alone at the very end of the report and which weren't necessarily linked back to the trends analysed in the main body when setting out recommendations for change. Nor were those recommendations necessarily expanded on to tell us how we should be taking them forward. And we also found some commonalities in what they are, and I'll just bring it up on the next screen here. And some of these will be very familiar to you. And certainly while it is important to know how migratory routes shift and change with changing state policies or system shocks, it is useful to know the sex, the age, the nationality, the household income of the majority of victims being identified. And of course, it's important to know the modus operandi of smugglers. But have we asked ourselves, for what purpose are we gaining this level of detail? For whose benefit are we producing these studies if we aren't prioritising a proper examination of the recommendations they make? With whose money are we carrying this out, including with whose money are we paying for conferences like this? And we also need to reflect on our own desires and interests in working in this space and our desire to be recognised for our contribution. And so Megan and I, as counter-trafficking practitioners ourselves, we do regularly lament how certain programs that either we or our colleagues are involved in can be too short-sighted, under-resourced, cookie-cutter approaches to counter-trafficking that aren't delivering results. Or they're done for the sake of doing it, or worse, they're done with unintended consequences. And so while there is undoubtedly a huge amount of important work being done in the central and eastern and western Mediterranean region to mitigate risks and improve the lives of many thousands that are moving, Given the well-known perennial challenges to addressing human trafficking effectively and the lack of progress made to date, Megan and I believe that critical thinking is desperately needed to reinvigorate counter-trafficking policy and programming in what has become one of the most violent and despairing regions of the world. So I'll hand it over to Megan.
Great, just checking you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, just picking up where Sarah started. So the 3P paradigm of prosecution, protection, and prevention is the fundamental framework for addressing trafficking at the international, regional, and national levels. Sometimes the 4th P of partnerships is added, emphasizing the need for a multi-agency approach. Counter-trafficking interventions, particularly in the context of mixed flows, can include rescue and repatriation programs for victims, education programs about the dangerous methods of smugglers and traffickers, development programs aimed at improving economic livelihoods in trafficking hotspots, and international and bilateral policing efforts aimed at securing borders and arresting people smugglers and traffickers. So here you can see on the slide, there are numerous handbooks, toolkits, training packages, indicators, and so on. And you can see some of these here that follow this approach. And there is a distinctly criminal justice flavor to the existing frameworks. So these interventions rarely tackle long-term development issues, leaving the 3rd P of the classic 3P approach to counter-trafficking prevention as either the elephant in the room or relegated to a standalone recommendation for more research into root causes, as we've just discussed. Because developmental change, though, is difficult to measure and less legible than the number of victims identified, safe shelters operating, or convictions secured, and because political questions around poverty, commercialization of industries, migration, race, and gender can be loaded, unfavorable, and unwieldy, the counter-trafficking sector has shifted towards a logic of emergency in order to save lives and rescue its victims instead. The counter-trafficking industry, we find, engages a humanitarian discourse of exception, which transforms practices and transplants actors. According to Dr. Sverre Moland, the initiators of anti-trafficking activities who carried out microcredit programs in the early 2000s would have been puzzled if they had known that less than 20 years later, former army and police officers would replace them. So the counter-trafficking landscape has really ballooned in the last decade to feature a multitude of UN agencies, NGOs, philanthropists, state governments, and celebrities alike who have jumped on the bandwagon of its moral imperative, including ourselves. Development is also not the silver bullet either. Numerous studies have reported on the confluence of multiple complexities associated with the combating of human trafficking, which we need to give more attention to. Whether we like to admit it or not, human trafficking and the programs to counter it are shaped by hegemonic norms and institutions, colonial legacies, asymmetric power relations, and ideologies, which are often neoliberal, racist, or patriarchal. The abolition of human trafficking creates a simple, more imperative with enormous popular appeal, while it depoliticizes and absolves, often behind a humanitarian agenda, the state for its role in creating structures that permit, if not encourage, at times vulnerability to trafficking. And so this abolitionist underpinning in the counter-trafficking regime enables states and their corporate partners to champion the anti-trafficking cause through efforts to root out the bad actors and rescue the victims, while deeming unnecessary any commitment to addressing more of the underlying causes of exploitation. So you have these bad apples, traffickers, criminals, clients, pimps, corrupt immigration or police officers, or specific corporations that violate labor laws, or isolated national governments that oppose Western hegemony are casted then as the perpetrators. And this kind of framing identifies human trafficking as a crime committed by individual actors, as opposed to the results of global disparities in wealth, social exclusion, and discrimination in labor and migration frameworks. Over, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Megan. So we've put up on the slide sort of that confluence of factors that can contribute to trafficking. And you can see that they are unwieldy and loaded, and certainly they can be hard to stomach when you're thinking about designing a counter-trafficking program or policy. And I'm just going to discuss two of the hegemonic norms that Megan touched on that do inform programming as it's done today and which do show up. And these could be reflected upon when you embark on designing your own activities in this space. There's just a little bit of feedback if anyone can mute while I'm talking. Thank you. So let's take colonial legacies and ideologies. These are all around us and they do inform our approach to counter-trafficking, whether we like it or not. So let's take one of the main beneficiaries of counter-trafficking activities, and they are state police. The concept of federal policing was actually introduced to Africa by colonial powers, and colonial policing was centred upon extracting revenue and quashing insurrection. And that culture can persist among chronically underfunded and rent-seeking police sources on the continent today, and I certainly have engaged with some of them myself. And yet, the objectives of anti-trafficking policing in a sophisticated context have also evolved and developed to include things like victim care, reassuring communities, cross-border intelligence and cooperation with multiple languages and evidence bases, and a high level of professionalism. So before you try and transplant what you think is the best practice onto some of the police forces in the country or source country you're working with, consider, even again, whether you consider expanding their powers to raid and rescue under colonial era criminal laws. Know that this will require significant investment, mentorship, resources, and political will to change that could far surpass the budget or the timeline your donors have given you. Again, understanding demand, and this has come up already, demand for Nigerian prostitutes, for example, which is in the far reaches of Europe, as far north as Finland, or just generally for cheap black and brown bodies in the developed world, along with other markets for the sexual and labour exploitation of persons originating from former colonies, is grossly understudied. Why is that? We also know that smuggling and trafficking networks can be comprised of other displaced community members, often with family, kinship, and community or social ties to the victims themselves, and whose purpose or profits may actually serve their wider family, kinship, or community needs because they're not being met by the state, which is neglecting or abandoning them. And it can be extremely difficult to replace those livelihood options with something more acceptable. And this is in fact characteristic of several of the Arab and non-Arab tribes that are working in smuggling networks along the central Mediterranean, who otherwise shunned colonial border demarcation at the same time were excluded from political participation. So what do you expect? And of course, this makes us question who is vulnerable, and the vulnerability that can lead someone to go into a situation of exploitation can be the exact same thing that pushes someone into committing trafficking itself. And taking another hegemonic norm, let's talk about capitalism and global wealth inequality. So contrary to what some prominent voices in the counter-trafficking space do call for, raising a country's economic development will not automatically reduce the prevalence of trafficking. We need to move away from a simplistic view of poverty as only based on low income levels and open up our perspective to non-economic elements of poverty, such as gender discrimination, which can also help us identify who is being marginalised from economic progress, including globalisation or privatisation in a source country. And we should also keep in mind that before you go blazing guns in to regulate labour, a country may be built on informal labour, of which there may be very positive practices for workers, for example, to unite and collectivise that should be preserved. Keep in mind, finally, that it's not always the poorest that migrate in a risky, irregular way. Certainly it takes a lot of money and a lot of resources to get to Algeria, as that Cameroonian described. There was upward amounts of 100,000 K. And this is not an insignificant amount of funds. And we need to keep in mind that, in fact, raising a GDP can increase that outward movement. And this is just some of the factors under that umbrella of capitalism and global equality that we really need to think about, but also think about it from a social justice and economic justice lens. So this is just touching on the surface. And of course, we've talked a lot about complexity. So the question is, how do we deal with all of these factors and all of the complexity? A term that was also used by Vincent quite regularly at the beginning, when designing counter-trafficking programs. So I'll hand over to Megan to talk us through that.
Megan, just 1 second. Could I ask both speakers and basically all speakers to be mindful of the fact that we have translators trying to keep up? So please speak slowly and clearly to make sure that the translators can follow you. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Sure. So in trying to wrap our heads around some of the structural causes and consequences of the industry of human trafficking, we believe that rather than continue with business as usual in the status quo, we should really embrace this complexity and deliberately bring it back into the fold of program design. And in fact, complex systems theory can help guide us through some of our most multifaceted and ambiguous objectives without being overwhelmed in the process. So it's a framework that proves essential to chipping away at some of today's most pressing global problems, like climate change or public health crises. And you see this quote from Alex Ryan on the slide really encapsulates this well. Complex systems theory really suggests that a complex and ever-evolving social problem, such as human trafficking, cannot be achieved by using a linear or simplified lens like the 3P approach, and requires a more holistic perspective of the interactions between actors, structural and proximate factors, as well as emergent behavior in both the criminal justice system and the human trafficking system in order to combat it effectively. We would tend to agree with this and believe this to be a more promising and better framework going forward for addressing human trafficking. And then if you can just go to the next slide, Sarah. Great. So in closing, we posed the following 10 questions that we hope could foster more critical and self-reflexive thinking among counter-trafficking practitioners working in the Central and Western Mediterranean, and hopefully spur areas for further inquiry using a complex systems theory approach. And with that, I'll hand over to Sarah maybe for some closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Megan. I'm conscious that we've probably gone over time, but we just wanted to say that what informed this presentation is some research we've been doing over the last year that we hope to contribute to a book project that it will be looking at lifting some of the really rich critical literature out there on development and trafficking and bringing that into the policy space. So we're very eager to get your feedback on our thoughts, and certainly feel free to reach out to Megan and I if you're interested in it further or would like to contribute. But thanks very much for your time, and sorry for talking too fast.
Don't worry. Thank you very much, Sarah and Megan. These 10 questions are really tempting, and I was particularly tempted by your question. I think it's number 8. In what ways do counter-trafficking practitioners indirectly perpetuate trafficking? Could you maybe say something, maybe give an example of an answer? What should we be thinking of? Please.
Sorry, I think I was talking. Go ahead, Sarah. I think we were delayed on muting ourselves. Please go ahead.
I think, for example, you were talking about return programs earlier and how sometimes these may not be approached with the proper level of due diligence that is informed by the local community context that that person is going back into. So it's not simply the case of handing this person over a repatriation fund and then seeing them on with some kind of small business. That fund could, for example, actually draw adverse attention to that individual on return that could put them at risk of re-trafficking. Or, for example, they may not be able to access the family networks or others in their country of origin to even be able to utilise it or reintegrate in the way thought. So all we're trying to do is say to people out there, have a real think about sort of the different interrelated factors that are informing your programming and policy, and make sure you've thought about all of the possible unintended consequences that could arise at the same time, just in case. I hope that's one possible example.
Well, thank you very much. That certainly helps. I'm sure we come back to these other issues when we get to the discussion. For now, thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to Johanna Bögel, who is an advisor to GZ East Africa, the Better Migration Management Program. And she'll be speaking on the anti-trafficking's blind spot, long-term solutions for victims of trafficking. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just share my presentation. Okay, can you see the slides?
We can, yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm very happy that I actually heard long-term solutions for victims of trafficking and specifically reintegration and the way it relates to re-trafficking a few times already this morning, because that is exactly what I'll be speaking about. Anti-trafficking's blind spot, while there are many of them, one of the big ones I think really is this interaction between reintegration and re-trafficking. And the paper that I've been writing has a couple of key findings. Reintegration really is seen as the default long-term solution for victims of trafficking. But as we have also heard a few times this morning, for many victims of trafficking, reintegration programs do not actually work, at least not in the long term. And then these failed reintegration programs or these failed reintegration attempts turn human trafficking into a circular problem as victims of human trafficking get re-trafficked after reintegration. And the scale of this re-trafficking problem, I believe, really is under-researched academically, but also poorly understood and underappreciated on a policy level. And also when we look at the way that programs and interventions are designed, this is one of the missing links that is really not seen very often in program design and program implementation. My contribution is informed by cases in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, specifically the region of Somaliland. I've looked at the national referral mechanisms for victims of trafficking in these countries. In a way, these countries are good examples because they actually have national referral mechanisms, which is not the case for all countries in the region. And I've also talked with a lot of the local NGOs that actually work on reintegration and with victims of trafficking on the ground. So as mentioned, long-term solutions really in most cases seem to equal reintegration. And reintegration also is the only option that is discussed in these NIMs. Sometimes other options, such as resettlement or integration into the country where the victim of trafficking ends up, is mentioned, but it is not discussed in any level of depth. An example from the Ethiopian NIM actually is that it mentions, I believe the direct quote was, reintegration or other services that may or may not be available. So there really is very little focus on any of the alternatives. Also, when talking with the NGOs, they said that reintegration really is the default and the only option that they can offer these victims of trafficking in their shelter because it is the only option where there actually is any funding for. So having established that reintegration is the default option, reintegration also often is followed up on and monitored rather poorly. On average, the NGOs have been following up on this for 3 to 6 months, but there is no longer follow-up after this. And one of the NIMs actually specifically prohibited follow-up for a period longer than a year because they said this would stigmatize the reintegrated VOT further. So if we ask ourselves, is reintegration working or not, we really cannot give an answer to this because we do not have any data on the long-term effects of reintegration. There's one notable exception to this. There's been a longitudinal study being done by an organization called Shabdai in Cambodia. They've been working with victims of trafficking who have been reintegrated and have been monitoring them for a period of 10 years. And the outcomes of this study, while they're still being published, I think are quite telling. They said that reintegrated victims of trafficking have worse health outcomes, are more likely to come into conflict with the law, more likely to abuse substances, more likely to commit suicide. The majority of the victims of trafficking who have been reintegrated actually have remigrated over this period of 10 years, and most of them have done so irregularly. This made them very vulnerable to exploitation, but of course also to re-trafficking. And talking with the local NGOs in the East African context, they basically have been drawing a very similar picture. So why is reintegration so difficult for victims of trafficking? For analytical ease, I've been subdividing this into 3 factors, so of course they're all very interrelated. They're structural factors, personal factors, and household and community factors. If we look at the structural factors, this is really quite straightforward. the reintegrated victims of trafficking will face the exact same challenges at home that they have already faced in the first place when they've been trafficked. So there really is no reason to believe that things will be any better once they come back, and the situations that have led to them being trafficked in the first place will still be in place. There is a very strong economic dimension to this. There have already been few economic opportunities before, but on top of that, due to stigmatization, the reintegrated victim of trafficking will be less likely to actually get a job that pays a salary. So most NGOs then do these reintegration packages with economic empowerment, mostly some sort of small-scale self-employment packages, not because it is the best option and because there actually are some great business opportunities to be made, but because it is the only option available to them. And often the NGOs know that this will not allow them to actually pay their way through life, that this is not a sustainable livelihood, but it is the only thing that they get funding for. So the reintegrated victim of trafficking will still face poverty after reintegration. There also is a strong law enforcement dimension to this. In many cases, the initial trafficker is still in the community, sometimes even in the same household, once the victim of trafficking is reintegrated. And frankly, I found this quite appalling. So there were many cases where the NGO said that they have reintegrated the victim of trafficking, even though a parent or some family member or somebody in the village who has trafficked them in the first place and also was well aware of the types of exploitation that would await them would still be in the same household, and the victim of trafficking had still been reintegrated. Not because the NGOs were not aware of this problem, and in many cases, once they were aware of this problem, they tried to come up with alternatives. But as we have seen before, there simply are no alternatives provided under the NIMs. The second set of challenges relates to the trafficking experience itself. So as we've heard, a victim of trafficking, by the very nature of human trafficking, will have experienced gross human rights violations on the way. This leads to serious traumatization, and overcoming trauma simply is a long-term process. It does not fit into this 1 year reintegration, 3 months follow-up logic. It is something that needs to be done in the long term, and often once victims of trafficking get reintegrated to often marginalized communities, there simply are no psychosocial counseling services in place in these areas. This makes the reintegrated victim of trafficking more vulnerable after reintegration than they already were in the first place. The last set of factors here relates to community and household factors. So on a community level, there is a strong stigma coming with being a trafficking survivor that leads to discrimination and also the social exclusion of the reintegrated victim of trafficking. Often NGOs try to counter this by doing community sensitization on the ground. This can work, but there also have been cases where it has backfired quite badly. Cases where they have told people about the types of health challenges that victims of trafficking might face due to trauma, but also due to sexual exploitation along the way. And then the takeaway that people in the community had was not, this person is a victim and needs some special assistance, but the takeaway was more, this person probably is HIV positive and has been sexually promiscuous. We should not associate with these people. So quite often these types of campaigns where they try to raise the awareness of the community actually have backfired. And there were cases within the NGOs that I talked with where they said that due to this danger of stigmatization, their reintegrated victims of trafficking did prefer to reintegrate on their own, so to not actually have any contact with the NGO once they were on the ground, so that people did not see that they were associating with this NGO or that they have stayed in a shelter. On a household level, victims of trafficking often still have these heavy debts that were associated to their initial smuggling or their initial irregular migration routes. So often either they themselves or the household has incurred debt due to the experience that they had, or alternatively, they have paid the smugglers off, the traffickers off once they were released. And then, of course, there also, once somebody migrates abroad, is the expectation from the household side that they would pay remittances, which they then were not able to do this all then leads up to a sense of failure. Now, if we look at all of these factors together, we have the same factors that already led to the person being trafficked in place still being there. A lack of economic opportunities. We have often still the presence of the initial trafficker in the community or the household. The victim of trafficking has to deal with the severe traumatization. There might be stigmatization on community level, private debt, the household's expectation, and this feeling of failure. All of these factors together really mean that the reintegrated victim of trafficking is more vulnerable to re-trafficking after reintegration than they already were before. And one of the interviewees that I talked with was one of the NGOs from Somaliland, puts this very straightforward, and she said, there simply are no systematic safeguards against re-trafficking once the trafficking survivor is reintegrated. There are very few statistics on re-trafficking. We all know there also are very few statistics on human trafficking at large, but re-trafficking is suffering from this problem specifically, simply because in many cases there is no there are no questions, there's no category for has this person been trafficked before already. But all of the NGOs that I talked with said that they were aware of the problem with re-trafficking and they had come across cases of re-trafficking. One of the interviewees said he was comfortable giving an estimate, and he said that up to 30% of the populations that he worked with, of the victims of trafficking that he reintegrated, would actually be re-trafficked. And 30%, that is not a negligible number. But it actually is a number that seems to be pretty much in line with the international estimates and numbers that there are on this. There is a wide variety of estimates of re-trafficking, but 30% seems to be pretty much in the middle of these estimates. One of the NGOs also said that there seems to be an intergenerational dimension to the vulnerability to trafficking. So many of the victims of trafficking that they were working with actually were the children and grandchildren of victims of trafficking. So maybe a vulnerability to trafficking is something that will be passed on from one generation to the next. Overall, I get the feeling that within the policy, but also the program and interventions on the ground, there is a strong lack of awareness of re-trafficking, of where these dimensions, these factors come from, but also what to do about it. And it would probably be quite helpful if one would look at finding effective long-term solutions for victims of trafficking, not as the end point of the intervention chain, but really as part of a prevention program. So finding long-term solutions for victims of trafficking really should be seen in a prevention context. Coming to my last slide, the policy implications that I see from this are that first and foremost, we really need more research on long-term solutions for victims of trafficking. This butterfly project from Shabdai was a great start, but it simply is the only longitudinal study on this out there, and that is not acceptable. There should be more studies like this in different regions. There also is little awareness of the scale on the problem among policymakers, and little is known about the link between reintegration and re-trafficking. One should also try to actually target reintegration and alternatives to reintegration better and find out in which cases does reintegration work for a victim of trafficking and in which cases does it maybe not work. And in those cases where it doesn't work, which alternatives are there and how can they be included in the different programs that are out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bergel, for well, definitely making us think by showing the possibilities of re-trafficking and indeed solutions that are not long term. One thing that came up when listening to you is the role of local governments, local communities. Could you maybe say a few words on their role and how they can be stimulated in one way or another to help the survivor recover and to find his or her place in society? I mean, you also noted very rightfully, victims are sometimes returned to community or even a household where the initial traffic is still present. How can we, and again, there we need a local government, we need the local communities, focus also on the prosecution side. Now, instead of just, keeping the victim from returning home. Yes, I understand the risk involved, but how can we make sure that the prosecution side comes into action? So how do you involve the local authorities and the local community? If you could say maybe a few words about that. Thank you.
I think the national referral mechanisms really are a key factor here. So in all of these countries, the national referral mechanisms actually are a good way for the local governments, but also law enforcement actors, etc., to work together with the local NGOs, who simply are the ones who are closest to the communities, who have the best understanding of the local context. So the national referral mechanisms, I think, are a good way to strengthen really the protection side of the victim. But then, of course, law enforcement, as you mentioned, is the other side of things, and that is something where there simply needs to be more capacity building for law enforcement in these countries. Human trafficking among many of the law enforcement actors simply is something that is still considered a bit of a niche thing, and that is something where larger scale capacity building really should try to address that gap.
Thank you very much, Birgül. I just want to take this moment to call on everyone participating to use the Q&A function to throw in questions that we can use for the joint debate when all speakers have made their presentations. So please do use it to make the final session as interactive as possible. Now I would like to pass the floor to Ms. Damah Ramid, who is a refugee researcher at the International Institute for Social Studies, which is connected to the Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And the title of her presentation is Fit No More, Victims of Trafficking, Negotiating Vulnerabilities and Protection Gaps. Ms. Hamid, the floor is yours.
Say hi and ask yes. Hi, Mr. Joost Klarenbeek. Thank you so much. And I would like to take this opportunity also to thank, I would like to take this opportunity to thank UNHCR and MMC for giving me this opportunity to be able to present and discuss issues and protection concerns and challenges of mixed movements, mixed migration of the people on move.
So you're going to share the presentation.
Now I'm going to share my presentation with you now.
Okay, so here we can search this one. Yeah. And let's see.
Yes, we can see it now. Thank you.
Yeah.
See if it's working. Oops.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep.
See if they're on the first slide. Yeah. And then you click here, you know?
Okay. Yes. I'm going to present now my presentation. My presentation mostly focuses on the THB and how they navigate the complexity of protection gaps and vulnerabilities. I'm going to talk about the protection concerns from the scope of protection concerns from 3 areas, starting from Libya and going all the way to Italy, and then on the way to the Netherlands. I'm using the term migrants who do not fit because in political discourses and irregular migration and economical migrants are regarded as people who do not fit in the sense that they are unwanted migration, they are unauthorized migration in policy discourses, and they're considered as a problem that needs to be solved through policies. So this is the structure itself of the PowerPoint, and I move forward. And as we can see here now, these are the migrants arriving on their way to Europe. The mixed movement is, I appreciate the term used by UNHCR MMC as mixed movement, because the term reflects the human being language rather than using it as a mixed flow. When we look back, I think there are many stories, graphic descriptions of problem that migrants face in Libya. The human rights violation that they face in Libya has been highly described through different scholarly articles and in the media as well. But as we move on and coming through, as they move, in Libya, they face so many challenges that shapes their life trajectories. When we look at the picture here, we can see that these migrants are highly uncertain. The insecurity that is there, the vulnerability context that is very clear. And once they have expectations as they move as migrant workers, they have expectation for a better life in Europe. And as they come, the expectation might not, as they come, in the context that they come as migrants who are not, in many sense, they are excluded. I'm going to go through one of the stories that I came across as part of my thesis, my studies in my master's thesis in governance of migration and diversity at the International Institute of Social Studies. This is a story that has been shared with me by one of the migrants during the research. I was looking at the lived experiences of legality and urban informality, and how faith-based organizations provide space and are able to help the irregular migrants deal with issues of illegality, vulnerability, and insecurity. This story has been narrated to me by one of the migrants. The migrant was highly stressed. He was very traumatized. He came through Libya. He came from West Africa. He was a Nigerian. He told me that, as you can see from the PowerPoint, that he had his own businesses. He had his own business. He fled his country for political reason. But after reaching Libya, he was kidnapped by a smuggler who asked him to pay more money. And because he had no money, he said, I was taken to an underground detention and lived there for 3 months. I was beaten by smugglers so that I could pay some money. And the smuggler doubled the amount of money in Katwa Zuwara. In total, they asked him to pay $62,500. But since he didn't have the money, the smuggler asked him to do something else. And this is selling drugs and prostitution. And then he forced me to sign. That's what he said. He forced me to sign, or else I will be killed. I was taken to a boat that was leaving for Italy. And a few days later, I was picked by someone from the emergency camp and taken somewhere. And I was forced into prostitution. I spent eight months in this place. And then finally, I was able to escape to the Netherlands. As a consequence, I had 2 major operations. But when I applied for an asylum, I couldn't tell my story to the authorities during the interview because my mind just shut down due to what I went through. Therefore, my asylum application was rejected. When this migrant was narrating his story, he was highly distressed. Many times we had to halt the interview because he had to stand up. He was standing up and he was saying, who are you? I don't trust you. Who are you? I don't trust you. And I realized that the sense of trust has been damaged completely. He was highly traumatized. He was in pain. He stood up and he said, due to this sexual exploitation experience, I've had 2 major operations. And he pointed to his body and turned around and pointed to his belly. And then all of a sudden he said, I'm actually in real pain and I can't sit down. Then he gave me one paper and I looked at the paper and I realized that it was a prescription and he needed some medicine. So I had to contact the support organization so that they will be able to provide, to stamp the prescription for exemption of payment and make sure that he gets the necessary medicine. He says, I can't sit for long. My life has been destroyed. And this actually I could sense the vulnerability context, and I could understand the trauma that this person, his situation might be different, but I could realize that he was really traumatized. So looking back, and these stories provide meaning. We cannot ignore these stories. These stories tells us something about human trafficking and what migrants go through Libya, and as well as Italy and other parts as well. The human misery and the protection concerns. It provides a message which prompts us to act and think about in what ways policies will be made holistic. There will be we need to have a nuanced understanding of migrant subjective experiences rather than objective experiences, to be able to understand what they go through, how this affects their and shapes their life trajectories. Moving forward, I would like to discuss and see how this has been already, despite this being documented. I think we are failing in policy discourses. We are failing in actually addressing the problems that the migrants face, and looking at the disjuncture between policy and realities, as Filippo Grandi, the High Commissioner of UNHCR, suggests, requires an understanding that the Central Mediterranean routes have blighted tens of thousands of lives over the last decades. For many, their experiences in Libya are part of a continent that extends far beyond the country borders and characterized by unspeakable brutality and inhumanity. In articulating this complexity and the dynamics and this complexity on the everyday life of these migrants, I would like to provide some insights into the protection. I would like to provide insights into the protection challenges in Italy as they leave Libya and arrive in Italy. As you can see, for the case of this young migrant who has been healthy, but all of a sudden now he's physically and psychologically affected, and this has implication on his well-being, as well as we think of vulnerability context of migrants. Moving further, articulating the dynamics and complexity, and looking further ahead on the insights beyond what we can see here, is that there are really protection challenges in Italy. As IAM has already provided, has reported, there increased cases of women arriving in Italy being pregnant. The MI survey also pointed out that there have been cases of sexual abuse as well, and an increase of migrants, 81% increase of migrants. So the IAM has provided this. There have been psychological distress as a consequence of trauma, and it shows the vulnerability of the persons on the move. The protection in Italy is inadequate, as Commensura inventory report, according to Commensura inventory report, in the sense that access is limited. The legal remedy, access to services is limited. There's no adequate services, as well as there's no conducive mechanism for protection safeguards. Italian police routinely refuse to issue permits to those who claim to be trafficked unless they're willing to testify against the traffickers. And this may be as a result of most migrants. There could be several reasons behind this. There could be several reasons behind this, and one could be because they are the fear of reprisal, having gone through experiences of SGBV. There's the shame. Also, most often THB victims suffer from memory problems due to horrific experiences in Libya, and as well as the experiences in Italy of sexual exploitation and the related trauma, which freezes people knowing and feeling. This could be attributed, of course, as I say before, to their inability to provide information related to human traffickers and remember other details that are required by the Italian authorities. There's also no systematic victim identification system in place, and little training for professionals, as Palumbo has noted, and social path and procedures for issuing resident permit do not apply in practice in Italy. In paper, yes, but in practice, no. So moving further from Italy, we have, as Comencia also has mentioned, that we have groups of Dublin claimants, but as well as migrants, irregular migrants who seek protection in the Netherlands. For this reason, the issues of lack of trust of Italian authorities is something that has come up. Barriers that now the problem that has been expressed in the Netherlands is related to the policy and practical shift. One of the salient features was in 2019. We look at the trends of human trafficking. In 2019, there were increased cases of THB cases of victims of African background, and this created actually the Dutch authorities thought that there was a loophole in the migration control processes, and in that case, the strengthening of the B8 permit, which is usually issued to the THB victims, was strengthened, and this had impact on especially a group of Nigerians. Although there were 1,372 THB cases recorded by Comencia in 2019, 279 were with Nigerian background. So the case was, when we look at why especially Nigerians, one thing that can also explain the increase of the people from West African countries, of African background, was also the MI4 survey conducted in Libya. I think we can connect this to that and see the survey revealed that out of the 5,219 refugees and migrants, 81% originated from countries from West and Central Africa, while 19 are from East Africa. The practical implication in implementation of this new approach to victims and key stakeholders created some concern from the key stakeholders. One of the things that they mentioned was there was a gap in data, and they said there's this gap in data that affect the identification of those in really need. There's also one of the other things that was there were limited access to information pertaining to the THB cases was noted by the stakeholder organization. And one of the things that I would like to emphasize here is the three gaps. One was the protection gap because of the strengthening of the B8 regulation, which affected all migrants who are trafficked. This also had impact on the reflection period because they were not allowed, they could not be automatically be issued with the B8 permits, and there was no reflection period. And in that case, this created the most of the migrants were invisible, and this because they feared going to the authorities and knowing that they won't be able to get actually the B8 permit, and the fear of being expelled as well. The second was the information gap. This was the most of the information on the THB was classified, and due to the privacy law, this also created a problem to the stakeholder organization, which were concerned, because what Convention had pointed out was that there was a lack of trust, because there was no way that they had problems they encountered problems in following up on individual cases of the THB victims. The other gap that this strengthening of the permit has created, one of the other problems was the identification gap, the victim identification procedure. There was lack of victim identification procedure. The absence of the victim identification procedure also influenced the invisibility of the migrants, and this created also vulnerability. Knowing with the situation now with the pandemic and being out there, and there is a risk of exploitation and re-victimization. So the implications are perceived risk of vulnerability to further exploitation. Greta has proposed an alternative approach to victim identification procedure that doesn't involve enforcement, but that is not in place at the moment. The other thing that was mentioned was the vulnerability context of the THB victim and humanitarian impact. So as I moved forward, all this, when we look at the problems...
Excuse me, Ms. Hamid.
Yes.
How many slides do you still have? The 50 minutes have passed. I mean, I don't want you to rush it off, but please, I just want to remind you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I will go forward quickly. Sorry. Okay, then. So one of the main implications I will go through is the policy response, the migration policy response from a broader context. When we look at the regional strategies that deny access to safety, from the Libyan perspective, from countries. Regional strategies that deny access to the safety, and knowing that the solutions are limited in practice. When we look at the protection concerns and its underlying causes, the Convention of the Migrant Workers and their families in Libya, Egypt, and Algeria are state parties, even if Libya national law criminalizes regular migrant, and they seek to establish minimum standards that states parties should apply. It doesn't exist, and the other thing that impact migrants is the destination countries. The EU tend not to ratify the human rights. So the protection concerns and vulnerability, the SGB incidents that have been mentioned, of course, I will go fast quickly. And the vulnerability context, the physical and psychological effects and disadvantages and marginalization of the THB victims, the invincibility that has been mentioned by one of the stakeholders, that there are people we cannot reach, the personal stories of sexual exploitation in Libya and Italy, and the protection concerns in Netherlands requires a nuanced understanding that when looking at it from a broader aspect, understanding of migrant, as I mentioned, subjectives, and living. We have people, when we look back, we have people who are migrants who live and living with this memory in the physical scar and the psychological impact, and shame and its effect on the sense self makes it difficult for many migrants to make a living in Europe. These are things maybe we could reflect on as we continue to discuss. And due to the fragmented picture of the human misery in policy discourses, the link between protection risk and vulnerability context requires an nuanced understanding, looking beyond the structural solution by introducing some level of humanity and offering protection mechanism aligned to human rights consideration based on needs of the migrants and their personal stories. I think I will end up here. Thank you so much. And before I end, I would like to say that the demand for the demand and the supply for just to finalize, and the eternal human yearning for improving one's life make people vulnerable to the loss of trafficking. We have to accept that irregular migration as a reality and create legal pathway and benefit from migrant workers' drive and willingness to work and contribute to the host societies. and the economic development of the local, of the urban development and local communities, and destination countries as well in terms of remittance. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hamid. And I do apologize if,
I'm sorry for taking so much time.
No. I mean, I do apologize for having to maybe rush you through, especially given the, well, very important and very meaningful issues that you were discussing. A question for you.
Yes.
I mean, in your paper, you write about the victims that are returned to Italy under the Dublin Agreement and how they risk to be returned to a situation and place where they're exploited. Now, your paper is specifically about the Netherlands, which, well, for obvious reasons, I take a specific interest in.
Yeah.
But I suppose that this issue is bigger and that we can make it even Europe-wide. On the prosecution side, I was just thinking, there is generally a higher chance of a case being solved when this is being done by the police of the country where the crime took place, or at least as near to it as possible.
Yes.
Now, within Europe, there's close police cooperation. We have the sort of interstate trust principle. Shouldn't we intensify our work on a European solution to combat the trafficking in persons among some of the lines that we discussed earlier this morning, rather than having a situation where a few states have the victims in view, but do not have the proof to act on it? So how would we solve that dilemma? Can you say a few words about that, please?
Yeah, I think one of the problems we do have is the interstate trust. I think sometimes the states relation and cooperation sometimes override. States relation and economic relation may also affect the way cooperation and in issues that affecting and holding states accountable for trafficking that has been committed in their own countries. But what we need, I think, is a much broader intervention that bringing everybody on board, and I think in cooperation between international cooperation, so that state authorities as well as key stake players will be able to cooperate and work together in counter-trafficking efforts.
Thank you very much. Well, that takes us into the discussion. Even though, of course, we did start it in a smaller group in a way. I want to remind everyone that the live stream will be kept going during our discussion. We have about 60 people tuning in and really want to stay engaged, but I just want to share this with you as a point of information. Now, in the past hour, we have heard about legal pathway programs provide to victims of trafficking destination countries are scarce, that they are under pressure, that they're not modeled towards the profiles of the victims. In the Netherlands, as Ms. Hamid argued, that is because of a policy change, sending many victims back to the country of first European entry, where they might be re-exposed to protection risk and to trafficking. Ms. Beugel signals similar risks happening in countries of origin after return and repatriation has taken place. Where you have when there is no adequate follow-up or monitoring when victims of trafficking are reintegrated in the community, we may leave them vulnerable for re-trafficking, for stigmatization, and for exclusion. And Sarah Elliott and Megan Smith also point that this focus of reintegration is a key component of counter-trafficking programs, with much less attention for possible stigmatization and exclusion. Policy programs aimed at return and repatriation of victims of trafficking only, without paying attention to their medium and long-term perspectives, could therefore make things worse in terms of vulnerability of the victim rather than better. And Hamid has also pointed out that this leads to more irregularity, to more abuse, to more exploitation in transit countries and in destination countries in Europe. So I think one of my opening questions is, what could be the corresponding next policy steps in terms of procedures to change this? What are the responsibilities and options of transit countries and the destination countries in Europe? Beugel and Piotrovic have both talked about money, talked about attitude when it comes to policy solutions. In which ways do both influence each other, and how can we move towards higher value solutions there? How can states be motivated I think that's the key question here. How can states be motivated to put enough effort in countering trafficking in persons and at the same time take into account the most effective way and the most efficient way to do so? Elliott Smith, of course, discussed a more holistic approach to counter-trafficking, including structural, proximate factors, and interaction between actors. So the question here is, what kind of tools could be recommended to policy to switch from a narrow sort of counter-trafficking approach to a more holistic one, taking into account neocolonial and asymmetric power relations and ideologies? And I have seen that we had quite a few comments and questions coming over in the chat. And this is where I have to start improvising. I see also that Vincent Cachutel has asked a question, to what extent there is a framework in the ECOWAS space that would allow for a different approach to solutions, possibly temporary solutions, so that is not straight return for victims of trafficking in these countries. So then again, coming back to the original point, how do we offer solutions before people end up, well, in this case, in Libya? Just going quickly to the Q&As. Let's see a few replies being given. Well, just open the floor now and see if people want to ask questions. Please identify yourself and please also say specifically to which of the panelists or panelists your question is addressed. And now it's getting exciting from a technical point of view. Ayla, could you enlighten me here? Do we work with hands up, or what is the way for participants to bring their questions forward?
That's correct. And we have one request from Alice Masari, who has a raised hand. So can we change her to a panelist so that she can unmute? That will just take a moment to happen, which is happening right now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation. I think at the end was a mistake. I have no question for the moment, just enjoying the discussion. Over.
But I see a hand here. It's Janina Sturner.
Thank you so much, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. I'm a researcher based in Germany, and I'm working a lot on the role of local authorities in migration governance. So I'm not really sure to whom to address this question, but I was wondering if, for now, it doesn't seem like local authorities are so much engaged in all these questions. At least they didn't appear in the presentations a lot. So I was just wondering if any of the presenters could think about ways to engage local authorities, or how local authorities could play a role in the protection frameworks we addressed, since they are quite close to what is going on the ground.
Who of the panelists would like to pick up this question, please?
Sorry. Johanna, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll be very brief. I think in an East African context, but this is also something that I believe works for other countries. In the national referral mechanism, I really do see that local authorities would have a strong role on the protection side. We see in Kenya and Somaliland, etc., that, for example, the child protection officers have a strong role. Those are all based really on the local level. So I think having local authorities inside the national referral mechanisms really is an important point to check for, also when actually designing and implementing these.
Thank you. And Richard, from your side?
Yeah, if I can briefly add to that, speaking really about European countries. I don't know, and I'm not qualified to speak about Africa, but in some destination countries in Europe, there is significant engagement by local authorities, and it can vary even within countries. And I've seen that, for example, in Switzerland, where the levels of engagement can vary really quite dramatically in different parts of the country. So there's no doubt it can be done. And what we have sought to do in Greta sometimes is to, we don't just look for fault, we look for good practices too. And we try to highlight that when we find it. And there is no doubt, without naming names, some countries are doing, are quite effective in engaging with local authorities to provide services to raise awareness of trafficking issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, does that answer your question? Who else wants to shoot, please? I see a hand from Vincent. Please, Vincent.
Yeah, maybe on this issue of the attitude of the local authorities, you know, I was puzzled initially, again, the first time I went to Niger, is to see that in a place in and around Agadez, you know, historically, traffickers were smugglers before becoming traffickers. Smugglers were traders before becoming smugglers. I mean, you needed guides to go through the Sahara. You needed guides to trade. But then when the business became very profitable, it had a transformative impact on what those people were doing. And they see the potential for more exploitation and trafficking in person as a major source of income. The problem is with the criminal proceeds of that trade, they have reinvested money in the local communities, and entire local communities became dependent on the trafficking in person as a key economic activity. And for the authorities to address that is difficult because they don't operate outside of a context. I mean, they may be having a judicial response vis-a-vis some of them, but they are also aware that communities depend on trafficking in the large sense. So we need to have a holistic approach. I know it's easy to do. It's more complicated to put in practice because the sort of alternative economy that you have to do to propose to people in a place like Agadez takes a lot of time, and development actors are poorly equipped to have that sort of quick response with a quick impact. But I think we've seen some good practice in terms of judicial response, again, in Niger, also in Eastern Sudan, but those responses are, in my view, not holistic enough. Over.
Just checking the chat here. All right, there we should be happy. It's room for the next question, please. And I hope I see all the hands in my screen. And if you have your hand up and I don't see you, please just speak up. I mean, I will very stiffly allow that. Who has a question for any of the panelists, please?
We have 2 hands raised, Joost, from our attendee list. Could I have my colleagues change them to panelists? Sophie Vollmer.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Can we have the two attendees who are now panelists? Sophie, shall we begin with your question?
Sure, thank you so much. And thank you for this workshop. It's really interesting and inspiring already now, and there's more to come. I was actually wondering, I guess it would be Sarah and your colleague, let me quickly take a peek, Megan. I was wondering about the dilemmas of our focus on trafficked victims, in the sense that states themselves have a hard time caring for their people in a number of both countries of origin, transit, and destination. There's a question of the numbers of trafficked victims versus the overall flow of mixed migrants, where there are protection needs all around. So I guess this corresponds to Vincent's appeal to a holistic approach and a route-based protection approach. But it also put forward, at least to me personally, a bit the moral dilemma of providing more international protection only after you've become the victim of such a horrific crime. I was wondering if you could say something about that. Over.
Thanks. That's actually just a really excellent question. And this might be slightly anecdotal of an answer, but I think it's a really good point of reaching the threshold of like the act, the means, the purpose. And this often comes up actually when we do training with local authorities. Often police ask this question, or those who are working or coordinating with like NGOs, which are often comprised of survivors of trafficking themselves, of why do we need to reach this threshold? And again, kind of going back to Vincent's mention of holistic frameworks and what does that actually look like? What does an alternative framework that's founded in subaltern or alternative voices look like? Can we shift some of the ways we look at programs to look at those who are at heightened risk of trafficking, or those who are in these kinds of gray areas where choice and coercion commingle? So I think it's a very good question. I don't think it's, if Sarah wants to jump in anywhere here, but I'd say, I think it comes down to working with some of the non-state actors as well, and kind of working with a lot of these, you have like global, alliance of women of trafficking and different NGOs and civil society networks, and bringing them into the discussions, I think, as well, on what states can do, what police can do in terms of prevention or risk mitigation of human trafficking, I think is something we should start doing more.
Yeah, and I agree with Megan, and maybe just to say, Sophie, that the Palermo Protocol on trafficking, it was a response to a burgeoning phenomena of egregious harm that was happening in the 90s. That was quite exceptional. But as we've been talking about in this conference so far, that exceptional harm is now very much coming up all the time. And the question then is, with what resources do we have to demarcate between more or less needy? We do this all the time as humanitarian agencies. We always have to sort of work out who's more vulnerable, who's less, with what we have to deliver. But the hard question that's coming up is, it's becoming more and more difficult to distinguish those persons in need because there's more and more of them, and there's less and less money. And of course, as Vincent said, with COVID, we're probably going to face even more dilemmas there. And I don't think it's about throwing out the definition of trafficking. I'm personally a lawyer, and I see value in, legal terminology, and it actually helps states when they're faced with a whole array of issues to try to understand what they're dealing with, the specific needs of specific individuals. And there's reasons we have the legal frameworks we do. But definitely the reason that Megan and I are trying to look at this from a different perspective is because we need to ask more questions than just, should we identify someone as trafficked or not, or do we have the right resources? It's why the hell are we, or what is exactly driving the trafficking in the first place, and what other interests might be out there further afield and way further along in another country or in another setup or in another government that could be perpetrating it. And I think we can actually do this kind of inquiry if we give ourselves the time and space to do it. And I think donors could really come up with a critical checklist of what they're looking for in counter-trafficking programs that isn't repeating the same output over and over again without the results, that is actually properly monitored and evaluated, and then rebuilding in that accumulated knowledge into the next program. But we can talk more about that at another stage.
Could I come in on that, please?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. I want to just follow up something that Sarah said. I also speak as a lawyer, and I think she's absolutely right. I think we have plenty of law out there, and trafficking is well defined. And the last thing I want is to go and come up with another definition of trafficking. Sure, I'll get a couple of articles out of it, but really, what we need to do is enforce the law that we have and increase respect for and awareness of the law that we have. And that includes courts in destination countries and in source countries using the higher end of the penalties that are available to them when they are there. Because one of the things that really frustrates me in the European context is what low sentences are sometimes given to convicted traffickers. And I think there needs to be more in deterrence. But fundamentally for me, it's all about money. If traffickers could make more money from selling fruit, they would do so. There's just so much money to be made from it. And it's not that we're going to reduce the amount of criminality. I'm very either realistic or pessimistic about it. There will always be people committing crimes when there's a lot of money to be made from it. And unfortunately, right now, and for a long time, human trafficking has been one of the best ways to make an awful lot of money. So that's just to cheer up everybody a little bit for the day.
Thank you, Richard. Talking about cheering up, can I ask you, just bring up the point of, I mean, with human trafficking, there also has got to be a market. So, I mean, this is a message that we often get from some of the partners in Africa. You know, we have trafficking networks because there are people in Europe who want to use them. So, do you see a correlation between what's happening, let's say, on the market for victims, if that's what the word is, with growth or decrease of trafficking in Africa?
With trafficking in Africa, look, of course, there's a market for it, but there are two markets. There's a market of those who knowingly use the services of trafficked people, for example, in prostitution or through labor exploitation. And then there are those who unknowingly use the services of trafficked people. For example, I'll give you a very local example. I went to a local hand car wash in the small town where I live, and the workers were all speaking Polish. And I asked them about what they were doing there in Polish, and they were very nervous to speak to me at all. And I'm pretty sure that they were being exploited. Now, but that's nothing to do with Africa, of course. But I can buy a mango from Kenya in my local supermarket for about €1. And I wonder, how does it work that everybody along the chain of transport, production, so on, manages to make money out of this? And I can still buy it. I know the mango isn't shipped by itself in a box, but how is it that everybody can make money out of it and I can still buy it for €1? There has to, I think maybe there's some serious exploitation going on. And where is it most likely happening? It's maybe happening in the source country of the mango. Now, that does not mean there's trafficking, of course, but people who use the services of trafficked people need to be more aware of that. There needs to be more clarity or transparency in supply chains. And I think there's a significant number of people who would be pleased not to buy products or use services if they were aware that they had been produced partly at least through exploitation. Some people will still do it because they just want something cheap. But I think there are a lot of people who would feel pretty ashamed if they knew that services they were using or products they were consuming had been partially produced through exploitation.
Thank you very much, Richard. I understand we have a question from Eddie Otwyer, who has some trouble raising his hand electronically. Eddie, the floor is yours.
Yes, can you hear me?
Otwyer, sorry. Yes, we can hear you.
Good morning, everybody. Just going back, I had something to say when you were speaking about the last question, so bear with me. And you said, what are the next policy steps? And then there was talk about money and attitudes and local authorities. I was just reflecting that, you know, as now we move into the next stage of African-European partnerships, there is a really valuable debate that links trafficking to that strategic discussion. If you know, I think the professor mentions the situation in Europe, and even some authorities in Macedonia were, you know, just outpaced by the scale of the flows that are coming through. And even though that's a relatively buoyant country economically, and other authorities in Europe are engaged. You take that down to Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and you go outside the capital cities into where refugee hosting areas are, IDP hosting areas are, in conflict zones in those areas. And you will find, I think, I agree, or go up into Bosaso in Somaliland or Hargeisa or these places, you will find that authorities have far less capacities to work with than their counterparts. As you approach in North African countries, again, they have far more capacities, and not to say what you have in Europe. So I would suggest that you know, in these hotspots, and Vincent outlined the routes, from a practical point of view, there would seem to be some policy. You're talking about policy. Next step is to try and link those capacity issues to where you can involve local communities, and you know, where you can talk to local communities with communication with communities. It's CWC, and having that dialogue with communities. But they need money. Honestly, I mean, they need development, and not this group here, but they need these big strategic EU, AU development type investments that go in there, and that channel not just development to the capital cities. If you're going to involve local communities, you need the regional development policies to come in. There has to be something that gives, you know, a local mayor a computer so as he can communicate with the capital city. You know, they have to have some sort of themselves, some sort of managerial capacity to engage with the capital cities. How are they going to lead their communities on migration management at a border? And you know, I have to say that some of these areas have really valuable networks of national authorities. They just need to be reinforced. That's my thought. I'll summarize it at that. But I think it's a super important one in terms of you know, involving local authorities, getting them the capacity that they need. There's no solution without them. And when you get into the community, then I think the work starts, because you know, the dynamics of the local community in those areas with the diaspora in Europe. This is where the attitudes and the whole social dynamics either encourage or discourage at the end of the day. Just a few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dwyer, and apologies for misrepresenting your name. When the apostrophe goes, it can mean all kinds of things, but with the apostrophe, it all makes sense. Which of the panelists would like to react, please?
Could I just jump in? I was raising my hand.
I see Megan jumping in eagerly, please.
Yeah, no, this was, I'm so happy you made this comment, Edward, because I mean, in general, I think there's something to be said and something telling about like local actors, and as well as civil society actors or NGOs and civil society networks, CSOs, CBOs, all these organizations that are often comprised of affected communities themselves, who, and we talk about this again and again, right? Kinship family networks, and the links to traffickers and perpetrators are often people known, family kinship networks, strong community leaders and stuff. So we really need to be having these kinds of groups and the voices of people actually at risk or survivors of trafficking themselves who have banded together, like to hear their voices at the table more. I think it's quite telling sometimes the absence of this, or partnerships that are very asymmetric as well, right? So we might consider something a partnership, but it's more of a top-down kind of donor-partner relationship rather than something truly meaningfully a partnership. And I kind of see Sarah here looking to jump in and nodding her head. But I would say the lack of partnerships and engagement overall with these existing networks is very telling, as well as other related networks too. Like there's a big focus on sex trafficking and looking at different women's rights organizations and feminist networks as well across South Asia. There's just a really rich civil society network here that I think we could be better pulling on.
Thank you very much, Megan, for those comments. I will be taking over some moderation. I see we have another question from the group. Liliana Sorrentino, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you very much to all the panelists for the very, very interesting discussion. If you allow me, and it's possible, what I would like to offer is a comment and a reflection, and it's the following. I very much appreciated the introduction by Vincent and his focus on the realities along the Mediterranean route and in North Africa, on the severity of abuse that most of the refugees and migrants endure, and also how this distinction between trafficking and smuggling is blurred. So but then in the following panels and discussion, we have focused on trafficking and on the responses to trafficking. When we rightly change our rhetoric on the perpetrators and emphasize and equate the gravity of crimes that they commit, at the same time, we need to make sure that the victims of both serious crimes are equally afforded the rights and protection they deserve. And we run the risk that if it's all called anti-trafficking, that the response tends to be, as Vincent rightly pointed out, one to regular migration. So one which is focused on deportation rather than to remedies and rights. So I think it's also our language on speaking of victims of serious crime, be this trafficking or aggravated forms of smuggling, it really needs to be consistent, and we need to be inclusive in the responses of those. Otherwise, we have learned from anti-trafficking that it all goes into investigation and prosecution with an emphasis to return. And I think the panelists before really reflected on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that reflection. I see that we are quickly approaching noon, so I want to give the panelists a chance for any final reflections that they might have. Also, we have one comment from Dr. Georgia Cole in the chat box, which is just to invite panelists to think more critically about whose interests are served by counter-trafficking operations and how our research and practices are actually contributing to its alleviation. And so I know this very much ties into Sarah and Megan's presentation, but perhaps also more broadly. So does any one of our panelists want to kick off with a final reflection? Just feel free to unmic.
If I may, very briefly, I think that, of course, we can always ask for more resources to help trafficked people and to enable the work of law enforcement. But I really think sometimes that is an excuse used in some countries to avoid taking action, because a lot of it can be done with goodwill and the political will to do things. And I think sometimes we should try to focus on that aspect of it when trying to encourage states to do more. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Another panelist? Sarah.
Yeah, maybe just to throw something out there is, let's try and avoid sort of overly tautological discussions in this space. I've been working in counter-trafficking for about a decade, and we go around and around and around in circles. And a lot of what we've said today is very well known and is well written about. So it's about thinking, where do we take that leap to the next step? As Vincent said, there's a lack of operationalization of all the good practice. So is it because the information isn't synthesized properly? Is it because there aren't the right forums? Or is it because there are bigger structural interests that we're all still finding very, very, very difficult to make inroads in, and start thinking about how we can do that together? Because there's enough of us here with enough intellectual capacity and resources ourselves to do it. So we're really keen to start engaging in that way, Megan and I. And thank you very much again. It was a great panel and discussion.
Thanks very much. Any of our other panelists want to come in?
If I may, I think the point that was made earlier on partnership is an important one as well. So there are a lot of small organizations on the ground that work in this context for a long time and that know exactly where there are some low-hanging fruits where a little bit of money would really go a long way. But it also is up to the donors to actually listen what is needed on the ground, and then for the project design and implementation to also implement this in a way that it actually reaches that level. So I think this point about partnership, about listening to the practice on the ground on what is actually needed is an important one.
Thank you, Johanna. Any final comments? With that, then, while you're still pondering whether to unmute, I would just point out that this isn't the end of our program for today. In fact, I think because we've realized that there is at times of a blurring between some of the issues that we discuss in trafficking and some of those that we discuss in smuggling, that we'll be able to take up some points this afternoon. We will start at 2 sharp, so the live stream will end now, as will the Zoom. So if you're interested, please tune back in at 2 sharp, and if you're a speaker, then please tune in about 10 minutes earlier than that so that we can check our technology. A big thank you to Vincent and also to Joost for the wonderful keynote this morning, and to all of our panelists just now for the first panel of our workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, all.
Yeah.
See you later.
Thank you very much.